The Greenbrier Ghost, a story for the quiet hours. There is a place in the mountains of West Virginia where the roads wind through hollows so deep the sunlight only reaches the bottom for a few hours each day. Greenbrier County sits in the southeastern corner of the state, a land of rolling farmland and dense forest, of small towns with old churches and older cemeteries, where the mist rises from the rivers on autumn mornings and the past never feels very far away. This is Appalachia, a place where people have long memories and strong convictions, where families have lived on the same land for generations, where stories are passed down like heirlooms, polished by retelling, kept alive by the simple act of remembering. And there is one story from this place that has never been forgotten, a story about a young woman, a terrible crime, and a voice that refused to be silenced, even by death itself. Her name was Elva Zona Heaster, though everyone called her by her middle name Zona. She was born around 1873 in the Richlands region of Greenbrier County, one of 9 children in a farming family. Her father was Jacob Heaster. Her mother was Mary Jane Robinson Heaster, a woman whose name would one day become almost as famous as her daughter's. We don't know much about Zona's childhood. The records from that time and place are sparse, and the lives of ordinary people, especially women, were rarely documented in detail. What we do know is that she grew up in these mountains, in a world of hard work and simple pleasures, of church on Sundays, and neighbors who knew your business whether you wanted them to or not. By the time she was in her early 20s, Zona had already experienced her share of hardship. In 1895, when she was about 22 years old, she gave birth to a child out of wedlock. The father, a man named George Woldridge, according to the county records, did not marry her. In the small, tight-knit community of rural West Virginia, this would have been a scandal, a mark against her name, the kind of thing people whispered about. But Zona carried on. People did in those days. There was no other choice. She lived with her parents, helped on the farm, and waited, perhaps, for her life to truly begin. In October of 1896, Zona's life changed. She was running an errand in town, visiting the local blacksmith shop, when she met a man who would alter the course of everything. His name was Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue. He went by many names, Edward, Erasmus, but most people in Greenbrier County knew him simply as Trout. He was a drifter who had recently arrived in the area, looking for work and perhaps a fresh start. He found employment at a blacksmith shop along the old Midland Trail, a rough, unpaved road that wound through the county. Trout Shue was by all accounts a striking figure, tall and powerfully built, with black hair and bright blue eyes. He had the kind of easy charm that draws people in, the quick smile, the confident manner, the way of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. Zona was captivated. Within weeks, she and Trout were courting. Within a month, they were engaged. And on October 20th, 1896, despite the fierce objections of her mother, Zona Heaster became Zona Shue. Mary Jane Heaster did not like Trout Shue. She did not trust him. Something about the man set her teeth on edge, some instinct that she could not quite name but could not ignore. She begged her daughter not to marry him. She warned her that something was wrong. But Zona was in love, or thought she was, and she was 23 years old, and she had already been marked by scandal once. Perhaps she saw Trout as her chance at a respectable life. Perhaps she simply wanted to believe that happiness was finally within her reach. She did not listen to her mother. She married Trout Shue at the Methodist Church at Livesey's Mill, and the newlyweds moved into a small house near his blacksmith shop. But who was this man she had married? What Zona did not know, what perhaps no one in Greenbrier County knew at first, was that she was not Trout Shue's first wife. She was not even his second. Trout had been married before, in 1885, to a woman named Allie Esteline Cutlip. They had a daughter together, a girl named Gerta, but the marriage was not a happy one. Allie would later say, in divorce proceedings, that Trout was cruel, that he beat her, that he was violent and unpredictable. The local boys in Allie's hometown had heard the rumors. One night, according to local legend, a group of them dragged Trout from his bed and threw him into the frozen Greenbrier River as a warning. It did not change his behavior. In 1889, while Trout was serving 2 years in prison for stealing a horse, Allie divorced him. Their daughter Gerta was raised by Allie's parents, far from her father's influence. After his release from prison, Trout married again. His second wife was a young woman named Lucy Ann Tritt. She was only 16 years old. They settled on Droop Mountain in a remote part of the county. 8 months later, Lucy was dead. The circumstances of her death were, to put it mildly, suspicious. Trout claimed that he had been working on the chimney of their house and had accidentally dropped a brick which struck Lucy on the head. Others whispered that she had been poisoned. Still others said she had fallen on the ice while pregnant. The truth is that no one really knows how Lucy Ann Tritt died. What is known is that most of her neighbors did not believe Trout's story, but there was no proof, no evidence, no charges were ever filed, and so Trout Shue packed up his things and left Droop Mountain, drifting south until he arrived in Greenbrier County, where no one knew his history, where he could start fresh, where he could find another wife. Zona was his third. While awaiting trial for what would happen next, Trout Shue would sit in his jail cell and boast to anyone who would listen. He said that his lifelong goal was to have 7 wives. Since Zona was only number 3 and he was still a young man, he saw no reason why he could not achieve this ambition. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return to that small house near the blacksmith shop in the winter of 1896, where a young bride was just beginning to learn who she had really married. The marriage lasted 3 months, and then came January. On the morning of January 23rd, 1897, Trout Shue left his house and walked to the home of a neighbor, a woman known locally as Aunt Martha Jones. He asked if her 11-year-old son, Andy, could stop by the Shue house to do some chores, or to ask Mrs. Shue if she needed anything from the store. It was an ordinary enough request. Andy Jones often did small jobs for people in the community, but Trout was insistent. He returned 4 more times that morning to make sure the boy would go. Around midday, Andy walked to the shoe house and knocked on the door. There was no answer. He let himself in, as was common in those days and in that place, and called out for Mrs. Shue. He found her at the bottom of the stairs. She was lying on her back, stretched out straight, with her feet together and one hand on her chest. Her head was tilted slightly to one side. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. Andy crept closer, thinking perhaps she had fainted or fallen asleep in some strange position. But her eyes did not blink. Her chest did not rise and fall. He ran home to tell his mother. Aunt Martha Jones sent for Dr. George Knapp, the local physician and coroner. She also sent word to Trout Shue at the blacksmith shop. Trout arrived at the house first. By the time Dr. Knapp got there, perhaps an hour after Andy's discovery, Zona's body had been moved. Trout had carried her upstairs to the bedroom, laid her on the bed, and changed her clothes. He had dressed her in a high-necked dress with a stiff collar. He had wrapped a large scarf around her neck. He had placed a veil over her face. Dr. Knapp attempted to examine the body, but Trout made this difficult, and he stayed at Zona's side the entire time, cradling her head in his hands, weeping and moaning with what appeared to be overwhelming grief. Whenever the doctor tried to examine her head or neck, Trout became agitated. He would not let go. He would not step away. Eventually, Dr. Knapp gave up. He had found nothing obviously wrong with the parts of the body he could examine, aside from some slight discoloration on her right cheek and neck. He listed the cause of death as everlasting faint, an old-fashioned term for what we would now call heart failure. Later, he would change the official cause of death to childbirth, though there was no evidence that Zona had been pregnant. Zona Heaster Shue was buried the next day in the cemetery at Soul Chapel Methodist Church. She was 23 years old. She had been married for exactly 3 months. Before the burial, there was the wake, and that is when people began to notice. Zona's body was taken to her parents' home for a wake, as was the custom. Neighbors and friends came to pay their respects, to sit with the body through the night, to bring food for the grieving family. And they noticed things. Trout Shue's behavior was strange, even for a man who had just lost his wife. His grief seemed to swing wildly between extremes, one moment sobbing uncontrollably, the next almost manic with energy. He positioned himself at the head of the coffin and would not allow anyone else to get close. He had placed a pillow on one side of Zona's head and a rolled-up cloth on the other, propping her head in place. He explained that these items would help her rest easier. The large scarf was still wrapped around her neck. He told the mourners, tearfully, that it had been Zona's favorite. When it came time to move the coffin to the cemetery, several people noticed something that made them uneasy. There seemed to be a strange looseness to Zona's head. It moved in a way that a head should not move. People began to talk. In a small community like this one, people always talk. But talk is not evidence. Suspicion is not proof. And Zona was buried, and life, for everyone except her, went on. Mary Jane Heaster stood at her daughter's grave and knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that Trout Shue had murdered her child. But knowing and proving are very different things. What happened next is difficult to explain. In the weeks after the funeral, Mary Jane Heaster did something that might seem strange to us now, but which made perfect sense to her. She prayed. She prayed constantly, fervently, desperately. She prayed for a sign. She prayed for proof. She prayed for her daughter to come to her and tell her the truth. And then something happened. Mary Jane had taken the sheet from Zona's coffin, intending to return it to Trout. He refused to take it. The sheet had an odd smell, so Mary Jane decided to wash it. When she placed the white sheet into the basin of water, the water turned bright red. When she lifted some of the water out, it was clear, but the sheet itself had turned pink, and no amount of washing would remove the stain. Mary Jane took this as a sign. Her prayers, she believed, were being answered. About 4 weeks after Zona's death, Mary Jane Heaster woke in the middle of the night to find her bedroom filled with a strange, cold light. As she watched, the light began to take shape. It condensed and solidified until, standing at the foot of her bed, was the figure of her daughter. Zona was wearing the same dress she had been buried in, the high-necked dress with the stiff collar. She looked at her mother, and she began to speak. She told Mary Jane about her marriage, about the cruelty she had endured, about the abuse that had escalated behind closed doors, far from the eyes of neighbors and friends, and then she told her mother about the night she died. Trout had come home from work in a rage. He was angry because there was no meat prepared for his supper. Zona had tried to explain what she had made: butter, apple butter, preserves, several kinds of jelly, but it was not enough. Nothing she said could calm him down. He attacked her. He grabbed her head with both hands and twisted until her neck broke at the first vertebra. The ghost of Zona Heaster Shue appeared to her mother 4 nights in a row. Each night she repeated the story. Each night she added more details. She wanted her mother to know exactly what had happened. She wanted someone to speak for her, now that she could no longer speak for herself. On the final night, before she left, Zona did something that Mary Jane would never forget. She turned her head slowly, all the way around, until it faced completely backward, like she wanted me to know all about it, Mary Jane would later say. Mary Jane knew what she had seen. The question was what to do about it. She was not a foolish woman. She knew that if she walked into town and announced that her daughter's ghost had appeared to her with evidence of murder, people would think she had lost her mind to grief. She knew that ghosts were not admissible evidence in a court of law, but she also knew what she had seen, and she knew that her daughter deserved justice. She went to see John Alfred Preston, the local prosecutor. She told him everything: the suspicious circumstances of Zona's death, Trout's strange behavior, the red water, and yes, the ghostly visitations. She spoke for hours, calmly and clearly, refusing to be dismissed. Preston was skeptical, of course. He was a lawyer, a man of evidence and reason, but he was also troubled by something in Mary Jane's manner. She did not seem hysterical or delusional. She seemed like a woman who had seen something terrible and was determined to do something about it. He agreed to make some inquiries. What he found disturbed him. Dr. Knapp admitted that his examination of Zona's body had been incomplete, cut short by Trout's interference. Neighbors confirmed the strange behavior at the wake. And then there was Trout's history, the 2 previous marriages, the first wife who accused him of cruelty, the second wife who died under mysterious circumstances. Preston ordered Zona's body to be exhumed. Trout Shue protested vigorously when he learned what was about to happen. He complained, he argued, he made it clear that he did not want this examination to take place. It made no difference. On a cold day in late February, the coffin was lifted from the earth and opened. 3 doctors performed the autopsy: Dr. Knapp, Dr. Rupert, and Dr. McClung. They examined the body carefully, methodically, the way Dr. Knapp had not been able to examine it before. What they found confirmed everything Mary Jane Heaster had been saying. Zona's windpipe had been crushed. Her neck was broken between the first and second vertebrae. The discoloration that Dr. Knapp had noticed on her cheek and neck was bruising, the marks of fingers that had gripped and twisted with terrible force. Zona Heaster Shue had been strangled to death by her husband. Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Summer came, and with it, the trial. It began on June 22nd, 1897, in the Greenbrier County Courthouse in Lewisburg. It was a handsome brick building constructed in 1837, and it still stands today. If you visit, you can walk the same floors that Trout Shue walked, sit in the same room where his fate was decided. The prosecution's case was strong, but entirely circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses to the murder. The physical evidence, the broken neck, the crushed windpipe, proved that Zona had been killed, but did not prove who had killed her. The prosecutor, John Alfred Preston, would have to convince the jury through the accumulation of suspicious details, through Trout's history, through his behavior, through the weight of everything that pointed toward his guilt. Preston was careful. He knew that Mary Jane Heaster's testimony about the ghost would be inadmissible, even if he believed her, and it is not clear that he did. He knew that no jury would convict a man based on the testimony of a spirit, so he avoided the subject entirely. He put Mary Jane on the stand as a witness to her daughter's marriage, to Trout's behavior at the wake, to the facts of the case that she had observed while alive. And then Trout Shue's defense attorney made a terrible mistake. The attorney's name was William Rucker, and his strategy was simple: discredit Mary Jane Heaster, make her look like a grief-maddened old woman who had convinced herself of her son-in-law's guilt based on nothing but maternal instinct and supernatural nonsense. During his cross-examination, Rucker asked Mary Jane about the ghost. He expected her to crumble. He expected her to sound foolish, delusional, unreliable. He expected the jury to dismiss her as a sad, broken woman who had lost touch with reality. That is not what happened. Mary Jane Heaster took the stand in a simple black dress. She answered every question with perfect composure. She did not waver. She did not contradict herself. She did not seem crazy or confused. She seemed like a woman telling the truth. The transcript of her testimony was recorded and survives to this day. Some of it goes like this. The lawyer asked, "Now, Mrs. Heaster, don't you know that these visions, as you call them, were nothing more or less than dreams, founded upon your distressed condition of mind?" Mary Jane replied, "No, sir, I don't. The Lord sent her to me to tell it." The lawyer pressed, "And was this not a dream?" She said, "No, sir, it was no dream. I was as wide awake as I ever was." He asked, "Do you think you actually saw her in flesh and blood?" She said, "Yes, sir, I do. I told them the very dress that she was killed in. And when she went to leave me, she turned her head completely around and looked at me like she wanted me to know all about it." Mary Jane testified that she had tried to touch Zona during one of the visitations. She reached out for the coffin, she said, but there was none. Her daughter had stood before her as solid and real as any living person. The defense attorney, realizing his mistake, quickly ended his questioning, but the damage was done. The ghost had been introduced into the record, and because the defense had brought it up, the judge could not instruct the jury to disregard it. Trout Shue took the stand in his own defense. He spoke all afternoon, rambling and evasive, denying everything but explaining nothing. He was charming. He was confident. He was convinced that no one could prove what he had done. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 10 minutes, and they returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. 10 of the 12 jurors voted that Trout Shue should be hanged. Because the vote was not unanimous, he was sentenced to life in prison instead. But the story did not end with the verdict. Not everyone in Greenbrier County was satisfied with the verdict. On July 11th, 1897, Just days after the trial ended, a group of men assembled 8 miles west of Lewisburg. There were between 15 and 30 of them, depending on which account you believe. They had purchased a new rope. They were well armed. They intended to break Trout Shue out of jail and hang him themselves. A man named George Harrah learned of the plan and alerted the deputy sheriff. When Trout was told that a lynch mob was coming for him, he became, according to the reports, greatly agitated. He could not even tie his own shoes. The sheriff hid Trout in the woods that night. The next morning, he was transported to the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville, far from the reach of Greenbrier County justice. Trout Shue lived in prison for less than 3 years. In the spring of 1900, an epidemic swept through the penitentiary. Trout contracted the illness and died on March 13th. No one came to claim his body. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery near the prison. No trace of Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue can be found today. He never did get his 7 wives. Mary Jane Heaster lived for another 19 years. She died in September of 1916, still telling her story to anyone who would listen. She never recanted, she never wavered. She never stopped believing that her daughter had come back from the dead to ensure that justice was done. And Zona? Her ghost was never seen again. Perhaps she had accomplished what she needed to accomplish. Perhaps, once the truth was known and her killer was punished, she could finally rest. Or perhaps she simply had nothing more to say. More than a century has passed since that trial. If you drive along Route 60 in West Virginia today, near the Sam Black Church exit of Interstate 64, you will see a state historical marker by the side of the road. It reads, "Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. A few miles away, in the little cemetery at Soul Chapel Methodist Church, you can find Zona's grave. The tombstone is simple. It gives her name, her dates, and 2 words that have made her famous: Greenbrier Ghost. The log cabin where she died still stands, weathered but intact, a silent witness to what happened inside its walls more than a century ago. And the courthouse in Lewisburg, that handsome brick building from 1837, still hears cases to this day. The trial records are preserved there. You can read Mary Jane Heaster's testimony in her own words as she spoke them on that summer day in 1897, when she told a room full of strangers that her dead daughter had come to her in the night and named her killer. What do we make of this story? Did Zona Heaster Shue really return from the dead to speak to her mother? Did a ghost truly help convict a murderer? The skeptics have their explanations. Perhaps Mary Jane invented the ghost story to force the authorities to reopen the case. Perhaps she knew in her heart that Trout was guilty and created a tale that would appeal to the superstitions of her mountain community. Perhaps she found a way to give her daughter a voice when no one else would listen. If that is true, then Mary Jane Heaster was a remarkable woman, brave and clever, willing to risk her reputation and her sanity to see justice done. But there is another possibility: the believers, and there are many of them in Greenbrier County to this day. say that Mary Jane was simply telling the truth, that Zona did appear to her 4 nights in a row to describe in precise detail how she had been murdered, that the autopsy confirmed exactly what the ghost had said, that a mother's love and a daughter's determination proved stronger than death itself. Either way, the outcome is the same. A woman who had been silenced found a way to speak. A crime that would have gone unpunished was brought to light. A killer who thought he had gotten away with murder spent his last years in a prison cell, far from the 7 wives he had dreamed of. There is something unbearably sad about Zona Heaster Shue's life. She was young, she had already been marked by scandal, the child born out of wedlock, the whispers that must have followed her everywhere. When Trout Shue came along with his charm and his blue eyes, perhaps she thought he was her second chance, her opportunity to become respectable, to have a home and a husband and a life that looked, from the outside, like the life she was supposed to have. Instead, she married a monster, and she paid for that mistake with her life. But she did not stay silent. Even in death, she found a way to tell her story. Even in death, she refused to let her killer go free. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there is something powerful about that, something that has kept this story alive for more than 100 years, something that draws visitors to that little cemetery in Greenbrier County to stand before a simple tombstone and think about a young woman who would not be forgotten. The mountains of West Virginia are quiet tonight. The mist is rising from the rivers, and the old houses are settling into sleep, and the cemeteries are dark and still. Somewhere out there, the grave of Zona Heaster Shue lies beneath the stars. The grass has grown over it many times. The seasons have come and gone. The world has changed in ways that she could never have imagined. But her story remains, written in courthouse records and carved in stone, passed down through generations, told and retold on nights like this one to anyone who will listen. The only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. Sleep well now. The night is deep, and the mountains are keeping their secrets, and somewhere in the dark, the past is resting quietly. Or perhaps not so quietly, after all. Good night.